Welcome to another episode of the President's Diary podcast. This is a podcast by the Afro Foundation, and it's a podcast about global affairs and how leaders can respond to the opportunities and challenges that are shaping the future. I am your host, Destiny Afu, and today we will be diving deep into the outcomes of the 2025 G7 summit, which recently took place in Canada. We're having a special focus on the Ukraine war and the shifting landscape of global trade. My guest today is Jessica Rapson, and Jessica is joining in from the United Kingdom, and she brings in a unique insight concerning this critical global moment. A little about you, Jess. You are a machine learning engineer and a PhD student at the University of Oxford, specializing in intersection of statistical science and public policy. And your work focuses on the application of AI and decision making in public policy. And you are also a senior researcher at the G7 Research Group and director at the Algorithmic Governance Foundation, where you lead development and algorithmic solutions for better policy outcomes. Thank you for joining in on the program, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we just dive straight into the program because we have a limited time. Maybe we start by having a historical perspective of what the G7 is all about and how the role of the G7 has evolved in recent years, and what do you think were the unspoken geopolitical priorities heading into this year's summit?
Yeah, so the G7, as most people know, it's a group of the seven kind of Western countries with very large economies that are kind of politically aligned in certain areas. So it's not like the UN, where it's meant to kind of include all countries. It's kind of just these Western countries with similar ideology. It's Canada, the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, and also the European Union, who is not a one of the countries, but it is a member participant. So the kind of goal of the G7 is to get these kind of leaders together from these countries and ministers that represent specific areas from these countries together and kind of help them coordinate policy. So if you're maybe familiar with something like the G20, the G7 is very different. The G20 is a lot more formal, it's a lot more structured. There's a very set schedule just because there's a large number of participants. The G7 is very casual, and usually the goal is to kind of get these leaders away from the press or away from security, and they just allow them to kind of interact with each other and just build kind of stronger relationships. But one of the main goals for these kinds of meetings is to have stronger trade between these countries and stronger alignment on things like global development and climate crises. Um, so yeah, it's essentially a very like intimate gathering for leaders from these countries.
Amazing. And what do you think were the unspoken geopolitical realities before the 2025 summit?
Yeah, so this particular year was quite abnormal for G7, kind of given the hostilities coming from the United States, especially towards some of the other G7 countries. So President Donald Trump initiated kind of a trade war with some of his former or historic allies with the United States, especially Canada, that was hosting the G7 summit. So because of this kind of animosity, the focus of the summit was very different from what it normally is. Usually, the summits are kind of oriented towards kind of long-term alignment on things like climate change or global development, and sometimes dealing with occasion like crises that come up. This summit, I think, was oriented very much to kind of appeasing what leaders, especially Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, anticipated Donald Trump would care about, and very much limiting the ambitions of the summit so that the what could be done would be agreed upon by President Donald Trump. So it was a bit more restricted, but so the main priorities of this specific summit were you can kind of see that evidence from the chair summaries that came out of the summit. So there were six, one on transnational repression. So that's like kind of limiting actions by state actors to kind of influence people in other countries. For Canada, this is particularly relevant given the assassination of Hardeep Singh. Allegedly by Indian state actors. There was a focus on artificial intelligence, on critical minerals, on migrant smuggling, on wildfires, and on quantum computing. And then unexpectedly out of the summit, there was also a focus on Iran.
Hmm, Amazing. Now, I think one of the goals that leaders headed into the summit with was to discuss about the Russia-Ukraine war, which has been going on for over years now. And how will you assess the G7's unity on this topic, given that President Trump has been really critical about the issue? And were there any signs of fatigue or a continued resolve on it?
Yeah, so this year again was quite strange on that front. So the U.S. position, as you've mentioned, is definitely less certain with regards to Ukraine. So for the summit, Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, actually had a draft for a statement that the leaders were supposed to potentially agree on regarding Ukraine. But it was never signed. So there was no actual consensus on the G7 countries' position on Ukraine this year. Um, on top of that, there's, more subtle kind of actions taken by the American president that probably kind of indicate the current stance towards Ukraine. So Trump left the summit a day early, I think, as was reported pretty heavily. But he actually left, there was originally kind of planned to be a bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and Trump at this summit. So Zelensky actually came to the summit on the second day, and his plane landed about 5 minutes before Trump's left on the end of that first day. So they had absolutely no face-to-face interaction. And then on top of that, there was no declaration by the G7 countries on Ukraine. So this is like also in kind of extreme contrast to previous years. So last year in Italy, the G7 committed, I think, 50 billion in immobilized Russian sovereign assets. So this year there was no financial commitments made by the G7 as a whole towards Ukraine. Though Canada did commit bilaterally 4.3 billion from Canada towards Ukrainian defense. But yeah, no statement on position towards the Ukrainian war, and no statement on committing any new funding towards defense from the G7 as a collective.
No, okay. We know it was the last summit was President Biden attending, and this year was President Trump attending. Do you think in any way this has to do with your respective personalities? Because from last year's summit there was a lot of commitment towards Ukraine, but this year we have none. Do you see this as a way trying to appease the personality of President Donald Trump or fear of what he was going to do?
100%. Yeah, I think that's a very astute observation. So I think this summit has also kind of revealed how important the United States is to G7 countries and the West, I guess, as a international collective, because the ambitions for the summit were way less than they normally are, and they were also very, very clearly done to kind of appease the personal values or the assumed kind of values that Trump has. So also notably absent, in addition to the Ukraine commitments from this summit, there was no mention of climate change or environment whatsoever, except for a small kind of discussion on wildfires. But from that, nothing about climate change. And more uniquely strange for the G7, absolutely no commitments or discussion about global development. Usually that's a very large focus that the G7 has for kind of maintaining like soft power influences in developing countries. And given the United States' current position on that and cutting funding for USAID, it's very clear that that was removed from the agenda, probably exactly to appease Donald Trump. And then on the more less policy side, I think there was also some rumors that the G7 meeting place in Kananaskis this year was also kind of architecturally organized to kind of appease Donald Trump. Like they have a golf course in Kananaskis that they had to security clear for the summit, and this was done probably specifically to kind of entice Donald Trump to go and stay. And Mark Carney, when he visited Trump prior to the summit a few months ago, he also gave Donald Trump, I think, a golf hat and gave him kind of a nod to saying, "Oh, I'll see you on the golf course in Kananaskis." So kind of all of this appeasement just to kind of get this one leader in the room and kind of in the right mood to agree on a bunch of really, really high priority commitments for the G7 countries.
Amazing. Now let's focus on trade. In the past recent months, like 2 months ago, we've witnessed like an imbalance in global trade, which the World Bank indicated there was going to be a slump in the global economy. And this was mainly due to the tariffs that was imposed by Donald Trump on certain economies, large number of them which are partners to the United States of America. So I just want to come to you with this question. Do you think that the G7 delivered a clear vision on global trade resilience? given the protectionism that Donald Trump has, revealed in his policies?
Yeah, so I think the vision for global trade is definitely mixed coming out of this summit. So a lot of discussions that were probably intended to be had didn't happen simply because Trump left very early. But there were some positive outcomes. So as of I think last week, or early this week, the United States has kind of agreed to remove what's called Section 99 from the bill that's currently in debate in the Senate. And this is what people are calling the revenge tax. And this allows the United States to impose retaliatory tariffs on countries that are imposing tariffs on the United States for various reasons. Like for example, Canada has a digital services tax that's applied to U.S. companies like Netflix, with the kind of stated goal of making the Canadian companies more competitive because the American ones are quite large. But the through discussions that likely probably came out of a result of the summit, even though it took a longer time, 2 weeks after the summit's ended. I think it seems to be that there was some positive outcomes. So this revenge tax is being removed. And in response, the other G7 countries are removing some of the tariffs that were imposed against the United States. So Canada, for example, is now exempting the United States from that digital service tax. And the US is now also exempt from the 15% minimum corporate tax rate that the G7 wanted to impose on multinational corporations. So this is probably a very good win for the United States, from Donald Trump's perspective. And kind of probably disappointing for some groups that were concerned maybe more about perpetuating global inequality through like American multinational corporations. But definitely those were some positive outcomes of the summit, but probably mainly positive for the United States.
Okay, let's look at the aspect of developing economies, especially in the global south. What is your take about the G7? Are they taking account the needs of developing economies in shaping global trade rules, or is this just a game which works just for them?
Yeah, so I think the very easy answer to that is no. The G7 is for and by the G7 countries, so it's going to always fundamentally care about the G7. So I think this is also true for, any group that's working in global development. Most of these investments are meant to be eventually self-serving through either kind of expanding soft power or building investments in kind of growing countries. So the G7 is no exception to that. And one kind of example that comes to mind is last year at the G7, the EU committed to imposing quite heavy tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.
Mm.
I think up to 35% tariffs. And this was just to kind of protect the European domestic electric vehicle industry, where electric cars are quite expensive right now when they're produced in Europe, and they just weren't competing with the Chinese ones. But this, in my mind, is kind of an example of a G7 group or a G7 member kind of just basically choosing protectionism over the environment. So it's not really, this isn't great for China. This isn't great for the environmental goals of the G7. It's great for the European Union, and it's great for European countries that are producing electric vehicles. So I think the G7 is very similar in the collective priorities that they make. Um, and like I said, this year there were absolutely kind of no commitments to made towards aid or development or anything like that. I think some examples from last year, there was 150 million promised in grants towards the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, the AGIA. Last year, also 20 billion promised over the years to boost women's empowerment in developing countries, particularly African countries.
Mm.
And also reaffirmed a commitment last year for 600 billion by 2027 for investments in partner countries with a focus on Africa and the Indo-Pacific. So a large amount of money was moved around at the G7 summit last year. The G7's quite, internally looking. I think this has always been the case. For any country that's really involved in development spending, it's almost always kind of self-interested. So it's always looking towards, maintaining long-term kind of soft power influence or kind of investments in growing economies that kind of are self-benefiting. So the G7 is not really any different from that. I think one of the key examples for that is the tariffs that the European Union imposed on Chinese electric vehicles last year at the Apulia summit. the Apulia G7 summit. So this is like a 35% tariff for Chinese electric vehicles, in addition to an existing 10% duty that that Europe already imposes on Chinese electric vehicles. And this is just to make kind of the European electric car market more competitive, but at a clear kind of, unfair burden imposed on China, and as well clearly choosing protectionism over the environmental priorities that the European Union claims to be trying to meet. So this is just one example, but the this year even more kind of stark. No commitments whatsoever made for any kind of money mobilized for developing countries, and really no mention of any developing countries at all whatsoever. The only real kind of input from non G7 countries or non-developing or non Western countries was from South Africa, who signed on to the Wildfire Charter. But in comparison to last year, for example, in the Apulia Summit, leaders committed 150 million to the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, 20 billion to investments in developing countries for women's empowerment, and 600 billion by 2027 for investments in partner countries in Africa and the Indo-Pacific. So in contrast to that, absolutely nothing moved around this year in terms of money. So it definitely a large shift there as well, because the G7 usually does focus a bit on funding projects in developing countries.
Amazing. Okay, so let's look at the strategic issues of this summit and what we expect to look ahead. What do you think the summit tells us about the future balance of global power, given that we have organized multilateral institutions now like the BRICS, who are coming up, like to challenge the position of the G7. What do you think the summit tells us about the future balance of power?
Yeah, I do think this year does indicate maybe there is a bit of a shift in power, or at least as the US kind of isolates itself a bit more from historic allies, it probably diminishes the role of that alliance in influencing kind of global affairs. So you mentioned BRICS as well. So the G7 this year had absolutely zero kind of commitments to climate or emissions. The BRICS this year, I think just even quite recently, committed to moving private capital around for climate action in the global south. So already kind of taking the lead compared to G7 countries this year on action on that front. But it's important to remember that BRICS is also, not like the G7, currently not 100% politically aligned and made up of countries that have sometimes antagonistic relations towards each other, particularly India and China. So it's also, quite hard to make impactful policy change at the multilateral level, even within BRICS. But I do think it is a potential observation that the G7 might be kind of declining, and its influence in BRICS countries might be more increasing in the amount of influence they'll be able to have on global affairs.
Right. And do you think it's like the G7 still has the capacity to shape global policy on trade? Or we have rising nations like China now. We didn't really get any discussions about decoupling from China or de-risking from China. But do you think the G7 still has that capacity to have a voice or influence global trade and global economy?
Yeah, I think the takeaway from this summit is yes, but only if the United States is aligned with the G7, because the amount of kind of power that that G7 countries have in trade negotiations on the United States. The European Union obviously has quite a large market share in global trade, but it's really the United States that matters for making a lot of trade negotiations, especially for smaller kind of G7 countries like Canada, that probably doesn't have the ability to kind of make any strong negotiations with China independently.
Okay, amazing. Let's get to the last questions. What do you forecast? What do you forecast the next 12 months, the next 5 years to be? What should we be watchful of? Every summit comes with some goals and it comes with some responsibilities. What should we be looking forward to the next 1 year to the next 5 years as a result of the recent G7 summit?
Yeah, so for the next 12 months, definitely what to look for are ministerial meetings. So those are meetings of G7 ministers on specific kind of policy topics. So the media tends to kind of focus on the Leaders Summit, which is just that 2-day kind of meeting in June. But really, the real policy happens and the real kind of negotiations are happening at these ministers' meetings.
Mm,
So the G7 summit again this year was kind of unique in that they didn't plan any additional minister meetings after the summit. But I don't think that means that there won't be any. There likely will be some kind of follow-up meetings up until January when Canada's kind of chair position of the G7 summit ends. So I would look towards those. Also in the short term, some of the hard commitments that the G7 made this year, particularly there's a work plan on artificial intelligence and energy, including tracking data analysis that they aim to put out by the end of this year. There's also the G7 Critical Minerals Action Plan, which we should also anticipate to see before January of 2026. And then finally, the Transnational Repression, Resilience, and Response Framework, which is a new initiative that Canada's starting to kind of better deal with uh, international interference in domestic affairs. So those are all kind of concrete things that we should expect to see in the next few months. In terms of the next 5 years, I think that would probably depend on the United States position. The United States, I think, is hosting the summit within the next 3 years. So
mm,
that one would be interesting, given that President Trump will still be in power at that time. He was previously in power for a G7 summit, I think back in 2020, but that was during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it ended up being canceled and being virtual. So we don't really know how Trump would choose to conduct these meetings as kind of the leader of the host country. So what the priorities for the United States would be, or even if he personally has that much of an interest in kind of international collaboration, that remains to be seen. So yeah, I think the next years definitely depend on the position of the United States towards the G7. One thing that I found interesting when attending this year is I think a lot of people were floating the idea of like a G6, where like it was the six G7 members excluding the United States. I don't think I've ever heard anyone mention that before, so I don't think that's also something that's realistically going to happen. But I think it just goes to show the kind of fractionalization between the G7 countries with President Donald Trump as power in power.
Okay, now that you mentioned the G6, President Trump actually talked of the G8. We are meeting Russia back into position. I think Russia was suspended from the G8 in 2014 due to the annexation of Crimea. Do you
Yeah.
think it's like a future possibility that Russia once again comes on board?
I think I don't see that happening in the near future. So Russia's been out of the G7, formerly G8, for now over 10 years, and was only really involved for a short number of years before then, because it was admitted later in the process or later in the life of the G7, and then I think a few years later removed after the invasion of Crimea. So
Mhm.
I don't see that happening. Again, the G7 functions well and theoretically more effectively than other international collaborations because the idea is that all these countries are already ideologically aligned, and there seems to be a quite large ideological gap between the other G7 countries and Russia at the moment. But it's difficult to say in 10 years as Putin maybe like leaves power or ages out of his position. So it's difficult to say. I think probably it would be unlikely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing. Now, just a last personal question. This is for you. Okay, what would be your advice to leaders, maybe other leaders in the global South and leaders of the G7, maybe concerning about global trade and overall restructuring the global economy in a way that works for everybody?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one because I think the reason things are the way they are is not because of a lack of information, but maybe a lack of alignment in what actually benefits countries. So I think for the G7, I would probably like to point out that as the US stopped funding USAID operations in a lot of countries, Chinese operations that do the exact same kind of thing have almost entirely filled that gap because the infrastructure already exists. Like there's already contractors and there's already establishments kind of in place to provide like contraceptives, to provide food aid So it's very clear for people on the ground that the G7 or the American influence is easily being replaced almost one to one with Chinese influence. So I think if you're appealing to these countries that are all rational actors, and they're not really acting because they deeply care about global equality or whatever. They're acting because they want global influence. I
Mm.
think them understanding that their influence will be displaced, and then once it's gone, it's very difficult to get back, is what kind of motivates those countries to maintain and persist in those investments. So I personally would love to see basically like a space race, but with global development aid for these countries, where it's like the United States and China maybe competing for influence by just pouring a lot of money into like infrastructure investments. So we'll see if there is kind of a competition, especially for a lot of influence over sub-Saharan African countries. Maybe that would happen, but it, to actually have a change, it would definitely probably need to be self-interested for those countries.
Amazing. Oh, so Jess, thank you a lot for your time and thank you for joining in on this episode. I look forward to engaging with you on future, any other future engagements. So have a wonderful rest of the evening.
Thank you very much and excellent questions.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.